I think at the outset it might be useful to just define the issue a little more closely. So the topic here is projects to catalyse the West, but our panellists, our very esteemed panel, all in some way or another really are involved in projects that relate to transport for the city. From Kerry's point of view, in the Intermodal at the moment, that particular role, it's about freight, and I guess for the others it's about all of the other systems that make our city work. And we saw in the last panel around health just how important transport is, or the lack of transport is, for this region. But I thought I might just start by taking a bit of a broader context, which is just picking up, and this is nothing new, no original PhD thought here, but our cities are changing and the way we use them are changing, and we need to be conscious and mindful of that. One of the changes that's happening that you all know about is that there is this growth of cities. When I say cities, I don't mean the growth of local government areas and local government boundaries, because most places there's not many unincorporated parts of Sydney. We're all part of a local government boundary. I mean the growth of urban, dense downtowns, 19th century downtowns in particular. There's been a real resurgence. I remember watching, what's that great movie, Escape from New York, with the guy with the mullet. Remember that? And there was helicopters and there was a big barrier around Manhattan Island, and you had to get in, you had to go in with a gun and get in and fight away, and I don't know, he captured someone or he got out and saved the city. But that movie was actually picking up on something that was prevalent at the time, which was this fear of the downtown, you know, sort of white flight out of cities, the decline of manufacturing in the Lower East Side in New York and other parts of the world. And really, that was probably the time when suburban living, suburban housing, cookie-cutter housing with a bit of lawn and a fence around, that was when that was really, really sexy. And urban areas were really dangerous and problematic. And money was flowing out, capital was flowing out, and people was flowing out. That's all turned around now, and people are showing that they want to live in urban areas. I know people say, I want a house, we want a house, it'd be nice to have a house, but actually where their money's going, their rents, their investment dollars, their preferences are moving back to downtowns and 19th century downtowns. So this presents a challenge and an opportunity for Western Sydney, because we've got a population that's growing, we've got a massive affordability problem, we all know that. Western Sydney is growing, but I don't think it's going to be growing in the same way that it grew in the last 50 years, and that is significant in terms of the way we design our, in particular, these catalyst projects that are around transport. And the other thing that's changed, obviously, is that the nature of the economy is changed. We all know about that. It's not new. I think there's been a lot of research in the last 5 years about the growth of knowledge-based economies, knowledge jobs, smart jobs. All jobs should be smart, but, you know, jobs that are, in a sense, generating some sort of intellectual capital that's traded, and how they're agglomerating, joining, clumping, clustering together in certain parts of cities, and they're not going everywhere. They're not being equally distributed like manufacturing perhaps was. You know, what did you need for a factory? Tim, you needed good electricity and cheap land, and you could build a factory and the workers would come. It's all different now. It's about creating places of high amenity and wonderful amenity, and then people will go there, and then once you've got talent, maybe that's where the smart jobs go. So this is just a bit of a backdrop to the issue around transport. I wanted to maybe start, though, with you, Tim. I mean, on the one hand, we have a lot of public transport investment in this city that is spent in eastern Sydney out to probably around here. So the further you get, so the amount of return you get for your taxes from a public transport point of view, it's diminishing returns. As you get to outer Sydney, of course your options are less. Places are more sprawled. So you pay taxes and you don't get a lot back. Equally, you've got to pay more for private transport, for cars and for so on. On the other hand, when it comes to assessing new public transport projects, we've got to use a thing called benefit cost economic analysis. And under that scheme, it's going to be very hard to get a number of projects up in these outer parts of Sydney. So it just seems to be a conundrum. And I guess, Tim, from your point of view, you know, we've got north-south links, east-west links. There's a wonderful spaghetti diagram there that I presume you and others, smart people, are going to resolve which ones go first, second or third. But it seems to me that possibly none of those train connections to the airport are going to have high patronage for a long time, and possibly none of them are going to have a high benefit cost. So How do you deal with that as the leading transport bureaucrat in Australia, with the biggest system to run and expand? How do you deal with those two different views?
Thanks for that. I think it's probably worth then reflecting on the fact that what we're doing right now, and I'll stay on rail because you've started with that. So we're building Sydney Metro North West and we're building Sydney Metro City and South West right now. And Kerry and I were talking before, no one should underestimate the amount of effort that's going into that. That's 66 kilometres of metro that's underway right at the moment. Both will benefit massively Western Sydney. Both will benefit massively. We're also putting a lot of effort into the current train system across the board. Got a thing called More Trains, More Services going out there at the moment, where we'll put more new trains onto the system, higher frequencies, etc. That's across Sydney. That's not anything to do with east-west. In terms of the benefit costs of those metro lines, clearly the land use and more traditional transport economics are coming together better and better more recently. Last 10 years with the advent of wider economic benefits out of the UK, it's gotten better and better. It's still not perfect, but if you're looking at a place where we're at the forefront of that, it's probably our agency, because we are the ones who have to justify, as I say, 66 kilometres of metro, and as you clearly pointed out, lower densities in Western Sydney to look at the next lines that we've got on the table for Western Sydney Rail Needs Study. So finally, I think the thinking around between ourselves and Greater Sydney Commission in particular, where the relationship is massively strong, we will get the land use and wider economic benefit and the transport benefit even more interlocked. That gives a far better opportunity for what those economic evaluations look like. And that's working. That's working, and we'll continue to push that. Clearly, the build-up of patronage will be what it will be, but the placemaking that transport has always been, we're just recognising it more now. The placemaking that particularly urban rail has always been gives an opportunity to build more benefits into those projects and therefore give a better benefit cost outcome.
Tim, I think one of the best announcements I've heard in the last few years was the announcement about Metro West. It may have been a little too soon, I'm not sure, still working out some of the detail. But can you give us it just seems to me, the Western Line, my wife's been catching that train for 18 years now. She works at ICAC, I don't know if I can say that, but she's been catching the train and she's seen it go, when she started off, she could put her feet up if she wanted to. She'd never do that. She could spread herself out.
A little sign up the front that says not to do that, but yes.
That's she didn't do it. It's all right, Jim. And then she eventually just had a seat, and then she didn't have a seat and she had to stand. And now sometimes there's nowhere to stand. So we know you've got to do something about that. Can you tell us a bit more about where's Metro West up to? What excites you about the project? Sure.
So in Sydney, just in the short term, we're experiencing at the moment 20% customer growth on the Sydney Trains network, 20%. That's a railway line that's 160 years old, but at the moment, just in this last few years and the next few years, there's a 20% uplift in patronage. That's phenomenal. So we're rolling out the next round, as I said, of services, new trains, etc., to keep up with that. Notwithstanding that, what we call the T1 line, the Western line, is at capacity and beyond capacity at certain times of the day in the peak, as you would experience in any other major economy around the world. We do need to do something about that, because in the medium term, meaning around 2030, we will be at a point where that really does hit capacity for large parts of the day. That's why we have looked at Sydney Metro West. It's a natural place where we need to increase capacity. Clearly linking Parramatta CBD to the Sydney CBD as the two primary city centres within the city makes obvious sense. How we form that to the west of Parramatta, through to Westmead and to the east of the Sydney CBD are great options that the entire community should have a view on. So where we're at the moment is going through the strategic planning, strategic business case. Yes, it was announced late last year. We're just getting on with the work. In a similar vein that we got on with the work for City Metro North West way back when, and City Metro City and South West, we'll go through the homework now. And I'll probably cover off one other issue that you'll want to talk about, which is we've announced the route and the refined route for Stage 1 of Parramatta Light Rail. We're underway with that in earnest now. Stage 2, government committed to making sure we do the strategic planning before the end of 2017. That will work in concert with City Metro West. And for those that don't know about the announcement late last year for City Metro West, government basically said this thing will join Sydney CBD, it will join the Bays Precinct, Sydney Olympic Park and Parramatta CBD. How many stations we have in between there, what other alignments we might look at, what type of service it is open for a community discussion.
Excellent. Kerry, I might just come to you next. I know that the Moorebank Intermodal project, you know, like any big major project, there's people that love it, people that don't like it. I've been really impressed by the way when you've been talking about it, it's not just about the efficiency to the system, well, that's obviously the compelling argument for the whole thing. Can you tell us a little more about what it can mean for the local community out there in terms of jobs, labour, skills, innovation? Because there is that view that, it's a big box full of storemen and packers and that's okay, but it's not really great. It's not that at all, is it?
Thanks, David. The logistics industry is undergoing massive change at the moment, and you'd all be familiar with Amazon, and the reason they've done so well, frankly, is they deliver things on time and very reliably, and those of you who are Amazon customers for something would appreciate that. And more products are being delivered in that way, so factories in Shanghai are shipping their manufactured goods through to the actual shop rack. So the management of that logistics chain is now very sophisticated and needs to be very timely. We've got a situation in Sydney, as you all know, where Port Botany is extremely congested. We need the terminal at Moorebank to be able to manage the growth in freight, and that growth is particularly in southwest Sydney, as we've all been hearing today. The thing about Moorebank is that the trains from Port Botany to and from Moorebank will be relatively small shuttle trains, but very frequent, and Moorebank will provide warehousing and major warehousing for goods to then be packaged and distributed quickly, and it will be a very innovative operation once we get some scale. So it will have jobs for people that are interested in maintaining robotic machinery, who are interested in maintaining control systems and all the IT systems and power that goes behind running those systems. And this is going to develop into a world-class logistics operation, the first of its kind in Australia. There are such operations globally, largely in places like Shanghai, and it's going to provide huge job opportunities in Western Sydney, and particularly around Liverpool. On site, we expect that we'll have about 6,000 jobs. Not all of them will be at the high-skilled end, but we're speaking to the universities in the area and also to Western Sydney TAFE about the skills we need, and there's a lot of work going on with that.
And I mean, it seems that with all of these major infrastructure projects now, governments are starting to look at how they can involve young people, disadvantaged people, people that don't have training, that are marginalised. I mean, the typical view would be, you know, a kid growing up in a public housing estate who's dropped out of school. I mean, there is an opportunity to actually save lives through projects, isn't there? That's for anyone.
Oh, I'm happy to kick off that and then maybe hand to Maryanne. Across the transport cluster at the moment, there are more opportunities than ever before. There is a phenomenal amount of career opportunities, and people are taking those up in large handfuls. For example, our gender and diversity within transport itself is changing quite fast, and we want to market that more and more, which is why I shouted out here, because more and more females are coming in at senior leadership roles into our place. Because they're phenomenally good at their jobs, so we want more and more of them to do so. At the graduate and cadet end, we've never had more Aboriginal kids coming in. We just had our last induction just last week in terms of the latest cohort. Up and down the Pacific Highway, for example, there's a whole range of programs in place. Sydney Metro is doing a lot with disadvantage to assist them into jobs, and I'll leave it to Maryanne to talk about WestConnex because they've done some great stuff as well.
Tim. Thanks, David. Yeah, look, I think it is important. One of the key focuses for us, Sydney Motorway Corporation, working with Transport, has been to really look at the broader demographic across the corridor within which we work. And part of our commitment has been to ensure that we are providing job opportunities and training opportunities for disadvantaged youth, long-term unemployed, Indigenous youth. We've had about 30 people go through our Indigenous traineeship so far, and what's been really exciting about that is that it's not just been young males that are going through, but we're having a lot of young women coming through that process as well. And we have people lined up to come through those training programs. So there is a lot happening, and as Tim would well know, the New South Wales government actually specifies a certain percentage of workforce to be coming through from Indigenous groups, also from the female gender balance is really important. But really getting out into Western Sydney, and you mentioned earlier, David, you know, the change in the workforce demographic in Western Sydney, and I think that's something that we need to be far more focused on, with 1 in 10 Australians coming from Western Sydney, and certainly around 40% of those people coming from non-English speaking backgrounds. You know, there is such immense opportunity for government and for business in general to really start engaging more with that burgeoning workforce in the West.
But I think the Legacy Skills program has shown great leadership because it's a requirement. It's not a, we'll have a chat to the contractors and if they're nice people, we might agree and then we might forget about it. It's actually a requirement. I mean, I think there's an opportunity with the airport, not just within the Commonwealth site, but actually the airport city, the Aerotropolis, to really do something different. And Professor Martin Loosemore from UNSW, who's this social procurement professor, says we're actually leading the world. We're actually better than a lot of the models in London. I mean, I just think the airport's such an opportunity for us to take that one step, make it easier for business to do this. They want a one-stop shop they can go to. Sometimes it's actually about having the social enterprise that's looking after and training the young kids, and then they're providing the labour to the contractor to make it easier for them. Maryanne, just another question. Sydney's a building site. It's all over the place, trains, planes and automobiles. And I know that you know, there's supporters and detractors for every project, but what do we do? I mean, I can understand someone, they leave home, their road's blocked because it's getting fixed, the train station's being upgraded, the school's being upgraded, the hospital's under construction. What do we do about fatigue within Sydney? Because these big projects require public support. How do we actually keep people focused on the positive benefits of these huge projects while they're happening?
If you have the solution to that, I'd love to hear it. Look, it's not an easy task, and I think one of the really interesting facts over the last sort of 10 years, I guess, is the change in the way that society as a whole looks at government and looks at the agencies delivering infrastructure, and the expectations that people want the solution, but they want it now. And with technology, people are sort of, you know, our patience around the delivery of infrastructure and services has diminished somewhat, and it's our role as the organisations that are delivering infrastructure, whether it's transport infrastructure or social or education, whatever it may be, we need to better articulate the benefits to the broader community. And I think, you know, it is an exciting time to be working in the infrastructure space in New South Wales because we've never had so much happening. But to your point, it does mean that there is considerable disruption. Getting those benefits out there and actually articulating those benefits in a way that resonate with people is really important. Say it once, say it again, but actually engage with the community, engage with each of those important areas along your corridor, not just those that are going to benefit from a project, but those that are actually impacted by it in the delivery stage. And I think that's really, really important. We were just talking earlier about how far we have come from a government perspective in particular with regards to engagement. When the Sydney Harbour Bridge was built,
was there any engagement?
Sorry?
Was there any engagement?
Well, it's interesting. It took 8 years to build, and the government took 800 homes, just a little over that in fact, and there was no compensation at all provided to those families. They were simply relocated to another home.
Were they given another home, or they just...
They were given another home, but they didn't have a choice in where it was going to be, and they certainly didn't have an opportunity to engage with the state. So I think it's fair to say that we have come a considerable way with regard to that, but you know, it's really, really important to understand that the infrastructure challenge that we have has been heightened by probably a lack of delivery over the last decade, and we are playing catch up, but with terrific projects like Badgerys and the amount of investment that's currently going into public transport as well as into roads and social and educational infrastructure, we are going to have a terrific state to live in, and we just need to be a little more patient and tolerant.
David, could I just pick up on that just again? In terms of across the board, is why we a couple of years ago put in a CBD coordination office to do exactly that. We put out the Tomorrow Sydney campaign, which I hope everyone in the room has seen in one shape or form or heard on the radio or television campaign. We won't stop doing that for the next couple of years because we recognise that we're just talking outside. There's no Olympics at the end of this. It's just the next phase of growth for Sydney, and people will need to be patient. And all we can do is just over-communicate with them and be as fine-grained in our detail every weekend. We love Christmas, we love Anzac Day, we love Easter, not because it's a break, because we can get as much done as possible. And we'll continue to do that for the next few years. So there's a lot of effort and coordination across the transport cluster, West Connects, North Connects, Metros, all the rest of it. If you all see them all on one map, every weekend, that's what we do about what we're about to do again at about 5 o'clock on a Friday night to hand it back at about 2 o'clock on a Monday morning. That happens, it's like a mini Olympic event every weekend. That's just the new discipline of how we have to do things, and that's the care and empathy with which you have to work through the community because they're facing that disruption and therefore those delays. But one thing it is doing, and it's certainly happened in the Sydney CBD, it's allowing people to finally move around in different ways and really think about it, and not just simply sit in a congestion queue and say, I wish it was better. You say, well, I'm part of the congestion, I might actually travel later or earlier. People actually are doing it now. The CBD, we dropped the peak period by about 7% of car travel. You drop 7%, it feels like school holiday sometimes.
Very good. I mean, I think humility is a very endearing quality in the chief transport bureaucrat in this state anyway. Great. Shane, from the private sector side, I mean, it's often been kind of, the former Premier said, you know, we're the infrastructure capital of the world, we are. One of the early arguments from industry was that we want to see a pipeline because the skills come, they go, there's productivity issues, there's cost, there's a human cost, there's actually a price cost as well. But the good news is we now have follow-up projects and it looks like the pipeline is there for some time. And I guess the question was always, what do we learn from one project that we can apply to the next? You've been involved with the Sydney Light Rail project and we're going to build one in Parramatta soon, which is great, and we want it to go to Olympic Park as soon as it can. So what's your advice back to Tim as the chief bureaucrat about how that process worked and how we should do it differently in Parramatta? What's the best system we can have in terms of contracting and consultation and all of that?
Yeah, look, I'd just like to pick up on Tim's point about the CBD coordination officer. They have done a fantastic job, Marg and the team, and I noted when the first time they started changing bus routes and shutting down the city in terms of, or restricting access for vehicles, we saw straight away a patronage uplift on the Inner West Light Rail of 6% in October and then another 7% in November straight away afterwards. So there were a number of benefits, and I'm sure that, and I know I've heard Tim say it before, that the lessons that they've learned from that, they're going to pick up and transport to places like Newcastle, to places like Parramatta. So I know they're well aware of the lessons that they're learning and considering, you know, what has been done. Yes, there are some great things being done, but there are also some benefits, some lessons that are being learned. And we know through industry consultation, through engagement with government, that they are listening to us. There are opportunities for us to shape and also contribute to better projects, better delivery, better outcomes as we go along.
And look, if there is a stage one and a stage two, and hopefully stage two starts, you know, as the stage one's still being built, you don't wait, and I think that's certainly the commitment from government. I mean, how do you contract that out? Because the person operating stage one's going to have to operate stage two. How do you get value for money in that? process? It's hard, isn't it?
Well, I think, there's a number of, not just in New South Wales, there are a number of other jurisdictions in Australia where I'm sure government is talking to those other jurisdictions. They've seen what's happened, for example, on the Gold Coast, where there's an augmentation around the Commonwealth Games. There are lessons that are being learnt. The bigger issues are obviously a significant amount of these project costs are in CapEx. There are commercial arrangements that can be put in place that continue to deliver value for money for government.
Tim, anything further? I mean, obviously Gold Coast had, the first stage, and then the operator was appointed, and they're going to have to operate the second stage. You can't have different operators, so...
Sure. Those augmentation regimes, as they're called, a lot of work goes into those before stage one is actually, put to, market. So there's a fair bit of work goes into those, not that dissimilar to what we've got with Metro.
Lots of competition on stage one, and then stage two should be...
There's government has options to go in any direction it wishes to, and it needs that. So good folk like Shane stay on their toes when they come and have a chat to us. So Parramatta, we'll take all the lessons learnt out of CBD, both in terms of contract, commercial, but certainly on the street about how you go through utilities, etc. Because the best will in the world, you always find something you didn't expect, whether that's utilities or anything else. And Parramatta goes through some interesting territory, as we know. So we'll transfer all of those lessons learned. They've got a good project team. They've just opened up their new office in Parramatta, which we're delighted about for the delivery office. And they've been in interactive market processes with private sector partners for probably a year now. So they're very much reaching out, looking for the best way to shape that, and they'll think about that in terms of stage one, stage two as well.
I mean, it is great having the team here and a very large RMS office as well. Just a little bit of feedback from industry, particularly from the development sector. I mean, there is a major challenge at the moment with the concurrence role, particularly within RMS over major projects. I've been hearing this sort of again and again and again. I don't know what the solution is, whether it's an assumed concurrence or additional resources or a coordinator general, but across Sydney, every council that's dealing with major projects are saying, even the planning directors are sort of saying, well, we've kind of done our bit, but it's got to go off to RMS, and it can take a long time to come back.
David, I was just on the phone to their chief executive outside, so I'll take that back with me. I'll take that back with me.
All right, we're going to resolve that one. Now, look, another question that's very interesting is new technology, driverless cars, on-demand shuttle buses, last-mile solutions where technology can take a place. I mean, they're all exciting. We want them to be here tomorrow. I do. I want to use them. I'm happy to jump into the driverless car if it makes my life easier. But at the same time, you're planning billions and billions of dollars in future projects. So, I mean, that's a challenge. How do you be cautious and bold at the same time, and how do you sort of plough along with the demands we've got right here in Western Sydney? Sure. But you kind of know, well, maybe the disruption's going to make that redundant.
Sure.
And it's to the others as well, sorry, all of you.
Oh, sorry. I'll just maybe kick off with a bit of context. So we put out a digital roadmap last year for that very reason. And it's sort of three ends. The middle of it is mass transit that will always be delivered by government or some way controlled, even if it's franchised, outsourced or whatever. We will have to sort of drive that. At the sort of one end of it, you have how we do our strategic planning. I actually think that will be disrupted, like Uber, in a massive way. Artificial intelligence, robotics, etc. How we do timetabling and a whole range of other things. I think we'd rather have 3 17-year-old geeks, pulling stuff together instead of waiting 18 months for a strategic plan. We'd all like that. I can assure you I would. I think that's right for disruption. I genuinely do. Any professional services people in the room, listen to that, because I think that is coming. The other end, in terms of customer, I think we've already done a lot of that already. So it started out with apps. Apps are a bit old hat now, but we continue to sort of look for more and more places where we can improve the lot for customers, mobility as a service, etc. The mobility as a service, we've kicked on with a bit more work around just doing on-demand transport services. We've put an expression of interest out, not just because we like doing those things. We got a phenomenal amount of feedback from around the world because we put a digital roadmap out. So we're as ready as we can be. We don't want to have another Uber discussion, to be quite frank. We actually want to almost invite the disruption because it's going to come anyway. We think people will chase further up the food chain, so they won't ever compete with light rail, but they'll be in and around buses, they'll be in and around a whole range of other areas, and we just need to be as ready and as flexible as we can be. how we contract, how we look at digitisation. So we just see that as opportunity. Where we don't have to put a 52-seater bus around the block that you have to wait half an hour for that has 3 people on it, and we can do something else, all ears.
Is there, I mean, this to all of you, is there a consensus that these new technologies are far more likely to affect that last journey, from the suburb a few kilometres away from the train station? I mean, it's not going to replace mass transit, is it? I mean, you're just not going to, even if there's more efficiencies on freeways, you're not going to, have pelotons of 1,000 cars
But the way that
travelling.
mass transit works will change and the signalling systems and artificial intelligence will be able to make the timetables 100 times better than they are now and so on. And you will get immediate response on your device about, your bus is sort of late instead of having to get into the app and charge around and find it. But a lot of that is happening now, but it is going to disrupt freight too. The US is trialling driverless trucks, which are dropping freight basically at the edge of the city, and then a driver takes over. They're not up to driving big trucks around the city at the moment, but it's going to have huge impacts right through.
Where are all the truck drivers working? A million truck drivers in the US. They're all out of work.
Well, the job disruption is going to be enormous also.
And perhaps I could just ask all of you, I mean, we're here at the Out There Summit, out here, or it's sort of in the middle, but sort of out there a bit. And, this is part of, I guess, regional advocacy, which is, I think 5 years ago, I'm sure it existed, but it's on steroids. A lot of groups are doing, we're collaborating. I work with branding all the time on different things. And that regional advocacy, it seems to be really significant in pushing projects forward. But I just wonder, 2 things, are there limits to it? Do we get to a point where the rest of New South Wales says, you lot, you're getting everything, wait your turn, and does it create a them and us attitude amongst Sydney? I mean, are we one Sydney, are we 2 cities? How does that regional advocacy sort of impact on our sense of identity for our city?
I'm happy to kick off that. Look, I'll give you one example of not just being focused on Sydney or Western Sydney for that matter. We're Transport for New South Wales for a reason. 30% of the Rebuilding New South Wales money, asset recycling, $20 billion, is to regions. That's a lot of money. So we have programs called Fixing Country Roads, Fixing Country Rail, the minor matter of completing the duplication of the Pacific Highway. The last 155 Ks, $4.3 billion. There are phenomenal amounts of projects going on in regional New South Wales. In fact, we've got an even more greater focus on getting on with those as quick as we can. There are a lot of them, though. There are a lot of them. So we don't see it like that. We see we need to get on with where there is need, stronger communities in every part of the state. There just happens to be a very large need in Western Sydney right now because you go from 2 million people to 3 million people. That can't be ignored, and therefore we have a lot of projects. So I talked about North West Metro, South West Metro, North Connects and West Connects, to name but a few. But the Western Sydney Rail Needs Study, which I didn't talk about, we looked at north-south alignments, east-west alignments. We've finished the consultation now, and we're close to finalising that in concert with the Commonwealth. They are the natural next evolutions of the Greater Sydney Basin. They are the next natural things that we need. There'll be a good, healthy, and I think fantastic debate over whether it should be a north-south alignment or an east-west alignment, or both. So be it. What a wonderful problem to have.
Anyone else want to comment on that last point there, regional advocacy, us and them? No? I think we're all in favour of it, aren't we?
I mean, I think, more recently we are, as private sector, seeing more and more effort, and whether the effort hasn't been visible to us, but it is far more visible now, the effort and the expenditure that is being planned for regional New South Wales. And it's fantastic to see.
Excellent. Well, look, we're right on time. It's time for lunch. Chris Brown's come to wind me up. Questions? Okay, we've got a minute for questions. Are there any questions?
Thank you. I missed the beginning of the session because the last session ran late. So if what I'm about to say has been covered before I get in, I apologise. I guess I'm standing here very disappointed about what I've heard. Projects to catalyse the West. I've heard about transport. The major project that will catalyse the West is bringing jobs to the West. We've been told we're short of 300,000 jobs, 500,000 jobs, 600,000 jobs. We're about to build an airport. We talk about putting an aerotropolis around that and bringing jobs. So why do we not have a project here in New South Wales to attract jobs to the west? That would catalyse the west more than anything.
Good point. I mean, I think there's been other sessions dealing with some of the big job engines like health precincts, airports, big opportunities. And I suspect that infrastructure, if you improve the accessibility of a centre, it's easier for business to invest there and to find people to come and work there.
I'm happy just to make a comment. I mean, just around the Aerotropolis and Western Sydney Airport, I mean, there's a thing called a city deal between the Commonwealth and the state that, we obviously play a key role in terms of major roads, major rail and freight rail in particular, but we'll play our role, but that role is there to try and catalyse those hundreds of thousands of jobs, as you pointed out.
I think just the other thing to mention, whilst it's not policy setting as such, but it's some of these larger infrastructure projects such as WestConnex, 10,000 jobs, and our focus is obviously on trying to employ people in the West to undertake those roles. But importantly, if we want people to invest, if we want people to invest in and around Badgerys and other parts of the West, we need to ensure that we have the transport infrastructure in place to be able to support that. The freight task alone around Port Botany is set to more than double over the next 10 years. We need to be able to get people and goods from the west into the CBD and the other way, but we also need those north-south, east-west connections, and we are just part of it. Certainly your point is not lost on any of us. I think our role here is, from a transport infrastructure perspective, is to help support that jobs growth. And we need to obviously be looking at a far broader scale, and I know that the government certainly has that as a key focus, but we are probably more of a supporting role and really there to help drive potential in some of those western regions.
David, can I just say something about the Moorebank logistics terminal? The Intermodal, while it's being constructed, will offer over 1,000 jobs, but once it's operational, we'll have between 5,500 and 6,000 jobs on that site. And that number, if you compare it to the jobs in Liverpool Council area at the moment, that's 72,000. So we're going to have a big impact on job growth in Liverpool and also the types of jobs. And we're very focused on making sure that we get as much local employment there to basically try and keep people working near where they're living, which we'd all prefer to do.
I mean, it's a good point. We did have some earlier discussion around how, in particular, disadvantaged people that require skills, who are locked out of the labour force, how they can actually benefit from all of the projects on the list. So good question, though. We need the jobs. Are there any final questions? If not, we need to move on to lunch. So I'd like to if you could please thank all of our panellists today.